All right, so now I'm going to talk about the structures of the spinal cord. So here's our spinal cord. The spinal cord is a part of the central nervous system along with the brain. So the brain and spinal cord makes up the central nervous system. The spinal cord, so when I think about spinal cord function, I really think about, so the white matter, so if you look at the cross-section through the spinal cord, you'll notice that there's white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. White matter refers to myelinated axons. So myelinated axons will transmit action potentials much, much faster than unmyelinated axons. And the white color comes from the fact that myelin is primarily lipid, and it has a white appearance. So white matter means myelin, the majority of that tissue is made up of myelinated axons. So the white matter in the spinal cord really serves as a conduit of information to and from the brain, like between the body and the brain. So the white matter in the spinal cord is going to bring sensory information from all over the body up to the brain to be processed. And then it's going to bring motor information from the brain down through the spinal cord out to the body to carry out the response. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the function of the white matter. It's just it's full of tracts, ascending tracts containing sensory information and descending tracts containing motor information. All right. And then the gray matter, which is this tissue that kind of looks like a butterfly, the gray matter is going to be cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. Dendrites and cell bodies are never myelinated, all right? And in this gray matter, this is where all of the synapsing and processing will happen within the spinal cord. So the spinal cord really just serves as a conduit of information going to and from the brain, between the brain and the body. But the spinal cord also has the ability to carry out really simple reflexes. Reflexes meaning, like, you put your hand on a hot stove, and you want to immediately take your hand off of the stove without having to send that information all the way up to the brain. Have time. I mean, it's overall pretty fast, but if we want to minimize damage to tissues, our spinal cord can just very quickly carry out a basic reflex, and then our brain can be made aware of that pain later on. Does that make sense? So that's the function of the spinal cord, sending information to and from the brain, and then carrying out very basic reflexes that we want to happen very quickly, without having to think about it first. All right, so the white matter, so the first thing I do when I'm looking at the spinal cord is I orient myself with what is anterior and what is posterior. This spinal cord is in a vertebrae. It's in a vertebra, which, remember, the spinal cord is housed and contained in the vertebral foramen of the spinal column. So this model is easy to orient because if you see the spinous process, well, you know this is posterior, and the body of the vertebrae, this would be anterior. But if you were to just see the spinal cord without these identifiers, how you could tell which is posterior and which is anterior is what I like to do is I first like to look for, so the posterior median sulcus. A sulcus means a tight groove. Fissure means a deep groove. So right here, down the midline, there's a little tiny tight groove, but we don't see much space. This is the posterior median sulcus. Here, you can see more space in between, so this would be the anterior median fissure. Fissure is a deep groove. Another way that I like to identify it is, so see this bulge right here, and right here? This is the dorsal root ganglion. So dorsal, if you follow this root up, this is posterior or dorsal. You can use dorsal and posterior interchangeably, okay? So dorsal root ganglion, a ganglion is just a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. This is where all of the cell bodies of those unipolar sensory neurons are located. All right, so that's how I orient myself first, is what's anterior, what's posterior, right? And then from there, it's pretty easy to identify the structures of the white matter and the gray matter. So now I know that this is posterior, this is anterior, and then the sides would be lateral. If we're talking about white matter, you can call them columns or funiculi. I think columns makes more sense because column, columns go up and down, and then the white matter serves as tracks going to and from the brain, right? So columns to me makes more sense, and it's easier than funiculus. But if you name it a funiculus, it's correct as well, right? So here, like this is the posterior side. These are posterior, or you can say dorsal columns, right? Here, right here, right here, this is the anterior side. These are anterior or ventral columns of the white matter. And then out here and out here, these are the lateral columns of the white matter. So it's using anatomical terminology and knowing that white matter is called columns. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the gray matter follows the same thing, except instead of calling them columns, we call them horns. So back here, it's labeled number 38 here, but here and here, again, this is the posterior side. These would be the posterior or dorsal horns. It's labeled number 36 here, but right here and right here, these are the anterior or ventral horns. It's labeled number 37 on this side, but here and here, these would be the lateral horns. Yes? Okay. All right, so once you know how to orient yourself with what's posterior and anterior, and as long as you know white matter is columns, gray matter is horns, you're good, you're golden for that part, okay? This hole right here in the very middle, this is the central canal. This is where CSF flows. The gray matter that connects the two wings of the little gray matter butterfly, this is called the gray commissure. And then let's talk about the nerves. All right, so there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and all spinal nerves are mixed. Mixed nerves meaning they carry both sensory and motor information. All right, so in that video, if you have time to watch it, I go over reflex arcs and understanding like what is a basic reflex arc. And so the components of a reflex arc is you have to have a receptor to be able to receive a stimulus, like pain or hot, super cold, right? Stepping on a tack. So you're gonna have receptors in the periphery that pick up on a stimulus. And then that sensor, so one, you have to have a receptor to receive the stimulus of pain. Then you have to have a sensory neuron that's going to bring that information into the spinal cord for a spinal cord reflex. That sensory information is going to travel through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root, and come in through the posterior side, right? So this dorsal horn back here is going to contain the axon terminals of sensory neurons, right? So spinal nerves are mixed nerves, but the dorsal root, so I want y'all to be able to see this. It's kind of hard because the way that it's oriented, but spinal nerves are mixed nerves containing both motor and sensory. But notice that it splits. It splits into a dorsal root and a ventral root. Can everyone see that where you're at? There's a dorsal root and a ventral root, yes? So spinal nerves split into dorsal roots and ventral roots. The dorsal roots, where you see this dorsal root ganglion, the dorsal root contains only sensory neurons. Right here, these guys, right here, these are nerve fibers of sensory neurons. This is the dorsal root, okay? So sensory information comes in, and then it will synapse in the integration center, which is the gray matter, with a motor neuron, and then that motor information is going to leave via the ventral root. So right here, these are ventral roots. The ventral root contains only motor neurons. Then eventually, the dorsal root and the ventral root merge to form a spinal nerve. The spinal nerves are mixed nerves containing both sensory from the dorsal and motor from the ventral. Yeah? Okay, cool. So I think that, yeah. And then, so if we're talking about the reflex arcs, you have a receptor to receive the stimulus of pain. That sensory information is going to travel through these unipolar sensory neurons, through the spinal nerve. Then it's going to split into the dorsal root, and it's going to come in to the dorsal gray matter, dorsal horn. This gray matter serves as an integration center, and it's going to synapse with either an interneuron or a motor neuron. Eventually, it will synapse with a motor neuron, which are going to be located here in the ventral horns. And then that motor neuron is going to leave through the ventral root, eventually merging with the spinal nerve, and then eventually synapsing with an effector cell, like a skeletal muscle, to contract so you remove your hand from that hot stove. So that's a basic reflex arc, okay? All right,